The official record, penned in the shaky hand of a parish clerk, states that Catherine Duval and her two children, Eloise and Gabriel, were lost to the Great Storm of 1874. It tells a simple, tragic story of a house splintered by cypress trees and a bayou that rose to claim its own. But in Lafourche Parish, where the air is still thick with the scent of rot and revelation, the official record is merely a stone dropped into black water. The truth is in the ripples that follow. They say that in the final, quiet hours of the flood, Catherine Duval was seen standing waist-deep in the murky water that had swallowed her home, a lone, gaunt figure in the dawn mist. Around her, the small, painted wooden toys of her children, Eloise and Gabriel, bobbed and turned in the current, a silent, circling funeral procession. If you find yourself drawn to the spaces where history has been written over, and this is your first visit to our archive, consider subscribing. Join us and ensure these stories are never again lost to the flood. The year was 1874, and the world of Lafourche Parish, Louisiana, had been rendered unrecognizable. It was a place less reclaimed by nature than fundamentally rewritten by it. The Great Storm, a meteorological event of almost biblical fury, had not merely passed over the land, it had scoured it, leaving behind a liquid ghost of what had once been. The bayou, typically a network of sluggish, predictable veins, had become a single, engorged artery, pumping brackish water over fields, through homes, and into the sacred spaces of memory and faith. For months following the deluge, the parish existed in a state of purgatorial suspension. The sun, when it appeared, did not dry the land. It baked the surface of the mud into a cracked, leprous skin, while the ground beneath remained a sodden, weeping wound. The humidity was a physical presence, a suffocating blanket that clung to the skin and filled the lungs, carrying with it the sweet, cloying perfume of decay. It was the scent of drowned livestock, of submerged forests of cypress and tupelo beginning to sour, and, the townsfolk would whisper, of things more sacred that had been denied their proper rest. The air itself felt heavy, saturated not just with water, but with a profound and lingering sorrow. The silence was of a new and unnerving quality. The familiar chorus of the wetlands had been replaced by a monotonous, oppressive hum from legions of insects, their drone a constant reminder of the rampant decomposition that fueled their existence. Water dripped with a maddening, metronomic regularity from the eaves of tilted houses, from the drooping fronds of palmettos, and from the bare, skeletal branches of water oaks. Each drop was an echo of the flood, a sound that marked time in a place where time itself seemed to have stalled. The landscape was a monochromatic canvas of grays and browns, broken only by the unnatural, vibrant green of algae that bloomed on every surface. Houses, once proud and distinct, sagged into the mire, their wooden bones softened and warped. Porches tilted at drunken angles, their support posts having given way to the liquefied earth. Doorways stood agape like silent mouths, offering dark, unsettling glimpses into rooms where silt-covered furniture lay in chaotic disarray, memorializing the water's violent intrusion. This was the world that remained, a place of profound and unsettling stillness, where the boundaries between land and water, and between the living and the dead, had become perilously blurred. It was within this waterlogged purgatory that the whispers about Catherine Duval began to circulate, passed from one survivor to another in hushed, fearful tones. The story was not one of heroic struggle or tragic succumbing to the flood's might. It was something quieter, stranger, and infinitely more disturbing. Catherine had been a widow for nearly 2 years, a woman known for a quiet resilience that had seemed, until the storm, as steadfast as the ancient cypress trees. She and her 2 children, her daughter Eloise, who was 7, and her son Gabriel, who was 5, had inhabited a modest but well-tended home on a bend in the bayou, slightly elevated and thought to be safe. The storm, however, had respected no such assumptions. The accounts of what happened, pieced together from the fragmented testimonies of those few neighbors who had survived on their rooftops, were unnervingly consistent on one point. After the main fury of the wind and rain had subsided, in the gray, pre-dawn light, they had seen her. Catherine Duval was standing alone in the floodwater, which came up to her waist, her white nightgown clinging to her gaunt frame. She was not struggling, not calling for help, not making any move toward the relative safety of the massive overturned oak that lay nearby. She was simply standing, motionless, her gaze fixed on something unseen in the distance. The most chilling detail, the one that rooted itself in the town's psyche, was the presence of the children's toys. A small, hand-carved wooden horse, its red paint flaking. A faceless ragdoll with yarn hair, its dress waterlogged and heavy. A miniature wooden boat that Gabriel had treasured. These items, and a dozen others, floated placidly around her, caught in a gentle eddy. They moved in a slow, almost reverent circle, brushing against her sides before drifting away and returning again, a silent, heartbreaking orbit of lost childhood. The witnesses said she never moved to collect them. She simply watched them, her expression unreadable, as if she were a statue erected in the center of her own ruin, a monument to a grief so profound it had transcended ordinary sorrow and become something else entirely. Something still and cold and terrifying. The official word, when it finally came, was delivered with the weary finality that had become the parish's default tone. The priest, Father Robideau, a man whose faith was being tested daily by the sheer scale of the devastation, had been the one to make the report. He was a tall, stooped man, whose black cassock was perpetually damp at the hem and stained with the pale gray mud of the bayou. He had known the Duval family well, had baptized both children, and had offered what little comfort he could to Catherine after the passing of her husband. His hands, which had once been steady as he administered the sacraments, now carried a slight persistent tremor, a physical manifestation of the spiritual exhaustion that gripped the entire community. He conferred with the makeshift civil authority, a grim-faced merchant who had lost his own warehouse to the flood. The conclusion was swift and, on the surface, logical. The Duval house had been catastrophically damaged, its back wall torn away. A widow and 2 small children stood little chance against such a torrent. The official report, therefore, was a model of bureaucratic brevity. It listed 3 names: Catherine Duval, Eloise Duval, and Gabriel Duval. Beside each name was a single stark annotation: all drowned, case closed. It was an attempt to impose order on chaos, to file away a tragedy and move on to the countless others that demanded attention. But in Lafourche parish, the closing of a case did not mean the end of a story. A profound and disturbing anomaly lay just beneath the surface of the official declaration. In a community so devout, so steeped in the rituals of the Catholic Church, death was an event that demanded ceremony. It required a requiem mass, a consecrated plot of earth in the churchyard cemetery, a wooden cross to mark a final resting place. Yet, for the Duval family, there was nothing. No funeral was held. No graves were dug. The small, crowded cemetery behind the chapel, which had seen so many new arrivals in the wake of the storm, held no space for Catherine, Eloise, or Gabriel. When questioned quietly, the priest would simply shake his head, his face a mask of weary sorrow. He would state that it was a tragedy, a deep and inconsolable loss for the community. He would report that their bodies were never recovered, claimed by the Bayou, and that God, in his infinite mercy, would hold them in his care. But his eyes would not meet those of his inquisitors. He would stare past them, toward the hazy, indistinct line where the gray water met the gray sky. The townsfolk knew what was left unsaid. The bayou sometimes gave back its dead. It would leave them tangled in the roots of cypress trees, or deposited gently on a sandbar as the waters receded. But of the Duvals, not a trace was ever found. No scrap of clothing, no ribbon from Eloise's hair, no small shoe belonging to Gabriel. They had vanished completely, leaving behind only the haunting image of a woman standing in the water, surrounded by the ghosts of her children's laughter. This absence was a far more powerful presence than any grave could ever be. It created a vacuum, a void in the narrative that the town's fear and superstition rushed to fill. The official report said they had drowned, but the haunted heart of Lafourche parish knew that drowning was not the same as disappearing. It was into this atmosphere of grief, suspicion, and unspoken dread that an outsider arrived. His name was Dr. Emile Carver, a man dispatched from New Orleans with a clear and dispassionate mandate to catalog the dead. The state required a comprehensive mortality report, a precise accounting of the flood's human cost. He was a man of science, of observable facts and logical deductions. He was young, ambitious, and carried with him a physician's professional detachment, a necessary armor against the horrors he was sent to document. He arrived by flatboat, navigating the strange new waterways that had once been roads, his leather medical bag resting on his lap. He was a stark contrast to the environment he now entered. His clothes were neat, his face clean-shaven, his gaze sharp and analytical. He saw a landscape of decay and ruin, and his immediate task was to quantify it, to translate the immense, chaotic tragedy into neat columns of names, ages, and causes of death. He set up a temporary office in a disused storeroom of the parish church, the only stone building to have survived relatively intact. The air in the room was thick with the smell of damp plaster and mildewed hymnals. By the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, he began his work, interviewing the priest, the merchant, and any survivor coherent enough to provide a reliable account. He transcribed names from lists of the missing, his pen scratching across the pages of his ledger, a steady, rhythmic sound in the oppressive silence. For the first few days, his work was grim but straightforward. He recorded deaths from drowning, from injuries sustained by collapsing structures, and from the waterborne illnesses that inevitably followed the flood. But as he delved deeper into the records of the parish, he began to encounter the story of Catherine Duval, and for the first time, his methodical process faltered. The official account was clear, yet every person he spoke to offered a different, conflicting detail. One man swore he had seen Catherine's house collapse entirely, slipping beneath the churning water like a sinking ship. Another, a fisherman, insisted the house still stood, though it was tilted and half submerged, and that on certain nights he could see a faint, flickering light in the attic window, like a single, lonely candle. An old woman whispered that Catherine had not been alone in the water, that two small, pale shapes had been moving just beneath the surface at her feet. The priest, when pressed for details, became evasive, speaking of the trauma of grief, of how the mind could play tricks on the eyes in the aftermath of such a catastrophe. He suggested the doctor focus on the confirmed dead, on the bodies that had been recovered and buried. He said it was best to let the memory of the Duval family rest in peace. But for Dr. Carver, a man whose entire profession was based on the reconciliation of evidence, the inconsistencies were not something to be dismissed. They were a puzzle, an intellectual irritant. The story of Catherine Duval was an anomaly in his otherwise orderly ledger of death. He noted the official cause, but beside it, in the margins of his journal, he made a small, private notation, a single, inquisitive punctuation mark. It was the first sign that his work in Lafourche Parish would not be a simple matter of cataloging the dead. He was beginning to understand that some deaths were not endings, but the beginning of a different kind of record, one not written in ink, but in the lingering, fearful whispers of a town haunted by a story it could not explain. He was there to document the history of the flood, but he was about to discover that what truly haunted Lafourche Parish was something far older, a darkness that the waters had not brought, but had merely disturbed from its long and patient slumber. Dr. Emile Carver began his work with the unassailable confidence of a man who believed the universe was a series of comprehensible, mechanical processes. Death, in his experience, was a biological event, a cessation of function to be noted, understood, and filed away. The supernatural was a diagnosis of a different sort, a symptom of ignorance, grief, or collective hysteria. His temporary office within the stone walls of the parish church was an island of meticulous order in an ocean of decay. He had cleared a large oak table, its surface scarred but solid, and arranged his instruments upon it with surgical precision. His ledger, a heavy, leather-bound volume with pages of clean, ruled paper, 2 inkwells, one for black and one for red ink, a collection of finely sharpened pens, and a small brass lamp that cast a steady circular pool of yellow light, a bastion against the encroaching gloom. The room smelled of damp stone and something else, a faint metallic tang he could not immediately identify, perhaps the scent of old, wet iron from a forgotten censer. Each evening, as the oppressive Louisiana twilight descended, and the chorus of cicadas and frogs rose to a fever pitch, he would sit at this table and transform the day's chaotic and emotional testimonies into the cold, hard currency of fact. He wrote in a neat, angular script, his hand moving with a steady, unhurried rhythm. He was not merely a clerk, he was a cartographer of mortality, mapping the boundaries of the town's loss. His methodology was rigorous. He would spend his days walking the muddy, makeshift paths of the parish, his polished boots perpetually coated in a layer of fine, gray silt. He sought out survivors, speaking to them with a calm, professional empathy that was designed to encourage clarity over emotional outburst. He would ask for names, dates, and the specific circumstances of a loved one's passing. He would listen patiently to harrowing stories of the flood, of rising water and splintering wood, his mind filtering the raw pain of the narrative to extract the essential data he required. The townsfolk, for their part, seemed to find a strange, small comfort in his dispassionate process. To have a death officially recorded in his ledger felt like a form of closure, a final, definitive acknowledgement that a life had been lived and was now truly over. For the first week, his ledger filled with the tragic but expected litanies of the flood. Dozens of names, each followed by a cause of death written in stark red ink: drowning, exposure, blunt force trauma. But the name of Catherine Duval remained a persistent, unsettling outlier. It was a story that refused to resolve into a neat, factual entry. Every attempt to solidify the details of her family's demise only seemed to dissolve the event further into a fog of contradiction and folklore. The more he asked, the less he felt he knew. He first sought out the fisherman who lived in a shanty built on stilts closer to the main channel of the bayou. The man was gaunt and weathered, his skin the color and texture of driftwood, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to reflect the perpetual gray of the sky. The doctor found him mending a net on his narrow, precarious porch, the water lapping just a few feet below. When asked about the Duval property, the fisherman paused, his hands stilling their intricate work. He told the doctor that he had seen the house just 2 nights prior, during the full moon. He said it was still there, though it listed heavily to one side, like a great, wounded beast slowly succumbing to the mud. He described the way the moonlight had illuminated the wet, rotting clapboard, making it gleam with a sickly, pale light. But the most peculiar detail was the light he claimed to have seen in the attic window. It was not the warm, flickering orange of a candle or a lantern. He said it was a cold, faint, greenish-white glow, like foxfire on a rotting log. He reported that it did not flicker. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic beat, like a heart that refused to stop. He told the doctor that he had watched it for nearly an hour, a silent, luminous metronome in the dead of night, before a sudden fog had rolled in from the water, obscuring the house from view. The doctor listened, his expression neutral, and dutifully recorded the testimony in his notebook, classifying it internally as a possible manifestation of swamp gas, a well-documented natural phenomenon. The following day, he spoke with a woman who had been Catherine's closest neighbor, a stout, pragmatic woman who had lost her husband and her home and was now living in the church's rectory. Her account was a direct and forceful refutation of the fisherman's story. She stated with absolute certainty that the Duval house was gone. She had seen it happen with her own eyes. She described the terrible sound of the foundation giving way, a deep, groaning crack that was audible even over the roar of the storm. She said the entire structure had splintered and collapsed into the floodwaters, washed away in pieces within a matter of minutes. She insisted that there was nothing left but a jagged hole in the shoreline, a raw wound in the earth where the house had been torn away. She told the doctor that the fisherman was a known drinker of homemade cane liquor, and that his eyes were playing tricks on him, perhaps out of some misplaced guilt for not being able to help his neighbors. She said it was better to believe it was gone, that it was a grave, and that graves should be left undisturbed. To the doctor, this seemed the far more plausible account. It aligned with the official report and provided a logical, if tragic, explanation for the family's disappearance. He made a note in his ledger, giving more weight to the neighbor's testimony, attributing the fisherman's story to a combination of local spirits and personal trauma. Yet, the discrepancies continued to mount, each one more unsettling than the last. An elderly woman, a matriarch of one of the parish's founding families, offered a third, far stranger perspective. She was frail, her skin as thin and translucent as parchment, but her eyes were sharp and lucid. When the doctor mentioned the Duval house, she did not speak of its structure or its fate in the flood. Instead, she spoke of the land itself. She told him that some places were porous, that they held on to memories and grief like the soil held water. She reported that the faint light the fisherman saw was not new, that her own grandmother had spoken of a cold luminescence that would sometimes rise from that specific patch of ground. Long before the Duval house was ever built, she described it not as a burning, but as a fever of the earth, a sickness in the soil that sometimes became visible at night. She said that Catherine Duval had been a good woman, a loving mother, but that she had built her home on sorrowful ground. The doctor, a man of empirical evidence, found himself at a loss. He could not file this testimony under any rational category. It was not evidence. It was myth, a local superstition used to explain the unexplainable. Yet, the woman's conviction was absolute, her tone not that of a storyteller, but of someone stating a self-evident truth. He left her small, cluttered room, feeling a profound sense of unease, the edges of his orderly, scientific world beginning to feel frayed. Frustrated by the morass of conflicting oral histories, Dr. Carver decided to seek solace in the one thing he trusted, the written record. He reasoned that the official parish registry, the ledger of births, baptisms, and deaths maintained by the church for generations, would provide the definitive truth. It was a tangible artifact, a source of information uncolored by grief, superstition, or moonshine. He approached Father Robideau, requesting access to the archives. The priest, who had been cooperative up to this point, suddenly became hesitant. He told the doctor that the archives were in a state of disarray, that many of the older books had suffered water damage, and that the records were likely incomplete. He insisted that the official report he had already provided was sufficient for the state's purposes. He said there was no need to disturb such old and fragile documents. The priest's reluctance was a red flag to Carver. It was the resistance of a man guarding a secret, not a curator protecting his collection. With polite but firm persistence, Carver insisted, explaining that a complete mortality report required him to cross-reference all available historical data. After a long, tense silence, during which the priest seemed to be engaged in some silent, internal debate, he finally relented. He led the doctor to a small, locked room behind the altar, the air inside thick with the musty scent of aging paper and leather. The parish registry was a massive, iron-clasped volume resting on a wooden lectern. Its leather cover was warped and stained, and the edges of its thick rag paper pages were brown and brittle with age. The doctor opened it with care, the heavy cover groaning in protest. He turned the pages, his fingers tracing back through the years, past entries written in the elegant cursive of long-dead priests. He found the records for the year 1874, and then he saw it. The page was a stark, physical anomaly within the otherwise orderly book. The bottom third of the page was stained with a dark, telltale watermark, and a fine, gritty residue was embedded in the fibers of the paper. It was river silt. His eyes scanned down the list of baptisms, and there, near the bottom of the page, he found the names. The first entry was exactly as he expected, in the priest's familiar, neat handwriting. Eloise Duval, baptized May 12, 1867. Beneath it, Gabriel Duval, baptized June 3, 1869. But then, directly below those two pristine entries, were two more. The names were written again: Eloise Duval, Gabriel Duval. This second set of entries was different. The ink was darker, blacker, as if the pen had been dipped in soot. The script was shaky, frantic, the letters formed with a heavy, desperate pressure that had nearly torn through the page, and each letter was smudged with the same gray river silt that stained the bottom of the page. It was an impossible, illogical duplication. Carver leaned closer, his medical training taking over. He examined the ink, the pressure of the script, the particulate matter embedded in the paper. He could find no rational explanation. It was not a correction. It was not a simple clerical error. It was a second, frantic declaration of the children's existence, written on a page that was already damaged by the very flood that had supposedly claimed their lives. The neat, historical record had been violated by a physical remnant of the tragedy itself. That night, Dr. Carver could not work. The image of the blotted page was burned into his mind. The cool, detached objectivity that had been his shield was shattered. He left the oppressive stillness of his office and walked out into the humid night air, seeking a clarity that now seemed unattainable. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the shimmering, fleeting lights of fireflies. He walked toward the sound of the water, the gentle, ceaseless lapping of the bayou against the shore. He stood at the water's edge, the damp earth soft and yielding beneath his boots. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil and decaying vegetation. He was trying to piece it all together: the fisherman's phantom light, the neighbor's certainty of destruction, the old woman's tale of sorrowful ground, and now the impossible, duplicated names in the parish registry. He was a man of science, confronting a data set that defied all known laws of logic and physics. He was replaying the priest's palpable fear, the way his hand had trembled as he unlocked the door to the archive. As he stood there, lost in thought, a new sound cut through the drone of the insects. It was faint at first, carried on the damp night breeze that drifted across the black, motionless water. It was a sound that did not belong in this landscape of grief and silence. It was high-pitched, melodic, and utterly chilling. It was the sound of children's laughter. It was not the sound of living children playing a late-night game. It was thin, ethereal, and hollow, with an echo that seemed to have no source. It came from the direction of the Bayou, from the dark, empty space where the Duval house had, or had not, once stood. The doctor froze, his entire body rigid. He strained his ears, praying it was a trick of the wind, a night bird, anything. But the sound came again, clearer this time, an innocent, joyful peal of laughter that was made monstrous by the context of the place and the hour. He was alone, in the dark, listening to the voices of the dead. The ledger in his office held the names of the drowned, but the air around him, the very fabric of the night, now held their laughter. His investigation had ceased to be about documenting the past. He was now an unwilling participant in its horrifying, inexplicable present. The laughter did not cease. It lingered in the humid air long after the sound itself had faded, an auditory phantom that replayed itself in the intricate architecture of Dr. Emil Carver's mind. For a man who had built his entire existence upon the bedrock of the observable and the quantifiable, this was a profound and terrifying schism in the fabric of his reality. His scientific principles, the very tools he used to interpret the world, were not merely failing him. They were becoming irrelevant, like trying to measure a ghost with a caliper. Sleep, when it came at all, was a shallow and treacherous state, populated by the recurring image of a page of a ledger, stained with river silt, where two names were written twice, the second set of letters seeming to writhe and bleed into the paper. The doctor's work, once a dispassionate exercise in data collection, had transformed into a singular, obsessive quest. The Duval case was no longer a line item in his mortality report. It was a malignancy, a logical cancer that threatened to metastasize and consume his entire understanding of natural law. He found himself returning to his notes again and again, poring over the contradictory testimonies by the dim, flickering light of his lamp, as if a new configuration of the same impossible facts might somehow yield a rational answer. He read and reread the fisherman's account of a pulsing, cold light, the neighbor's insistence on total destruction, and the old woman's pronouncement of a land afflicted by a fever of grief. They were not just conflicting stories, they were competing realities, and he felt himself standing at their impossible intersection. He knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that he could not resolve this from the safety of his makeshift office. The written record and the spoken word had become a labyrinth of mirrors, each reflecting a distorted version of the truth. The only remaining source of evidence was the place itself, the epicenter of the anomaly, the land where the Duval house had stood. He had to see it, to touch it, to apply the disciplined senses of a physician to the source of the haunting. He had to determine if there was a physical explanation, however faint, for the phenomena that plagued the parish. Was it swamp gas? A trick of the light through the dense, moss-laden cypress canopy? Was the laughter the cry of some nocturnal animal, misinterpreted by a community steeped in trauma and superstition? He clung to these possibilities, these last vestiges of a world that made sense, even as a cold, intuitive dread settled in his gut, a dread that whispered he would find no such comfort. The decision was made in the gray, silent hours just before dawn, the time when the boundary between the dreaming and waking worlds feels at its most permeable. He would go at low tide, the time the locals had told him the bayou briefly relinquished some of its stolen territory, exposing the bones of the land beneath. His journey to the site was a descent into a world that felt increasingly primeval and hostile. He followed a barely discernible path along the water's edge, his boots sinking into the soft, sucking mud with each step. The air was thick and still, heavy with the smell of wet earth and the sweet, cloying scent of decay that he had come to associate with the very soul of this place. Spanish moss hung from the cypress trees in great, theatrical curtains of gray, obscuring the sky and giving the light a diffuse, underwater quality. The silence here was different from the silence of the town. It was a deep, ancient quiet, punctuated only by the sudden, guttural croak of a bullfrog or the unnerving splash of something unseen moving in the murky water beside him. He felt a profound sense of being watched, a primal sensation that had nothing to do with human observation. It was as if the bayou itself, with its 1,000 hidden eyes, was observing his intrusion. As he drew closer to the location the priest had marked on a hand-drawn map, he noticed a change in the environment. The trees grew denser, their massive, buttressed roots twisting out of the mud like the gnarled knuckles of skeletal hands. The water here was darker, almost black, and unnaturally still, its surface a perfect, unbroken mirror reflecting the oppressive gray sky. There was a palpable coldness in the air, a drop in temperature that was too localized to be natural, a pocket of chill that clung to the skin and raised the fine hairs on his arms. He arrived at the bend in the bayou and stopped. The neighbor had been wrong, but so had the fisherman. The house was not gone, but neither was it standing. What remained was a skeletal outline, a ghost of a foundation. The flood had torn away the wooden structure, but the heavy foundation stones remained, forming a submerged, rectangular footprint. The tide was low, as predicted, and the black water had receded just enough to expose the tops of these stones, which were coated in a slick, dark green algae. It looked like the ruin of some ancient, forgotten temple, a place of worship for a god of water and sorrow. A profound and unnatural stillness hung over the site. Here, the constant drone of insects was absent. There was only silence. The doctor, his heart beating a heavy, measured rhythm in his chest, took a breath and stepped into the water. It was colder than he expected, a shocking, invasive cold that seeped through his boots and trousers instantly. The mud on the bottom was thick and soft, and with every step, his feet sank, threatening to pull him down. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes scanning the murky depths within the stone perimeter. This had been their home. This watery enclosure had been a living space, a place of warmth and family. The thought was a profanity in this cold, silent place. Then he saw the first object. Half buried in the silt was a child's rocking horse, its wooden body bleached and waterlogged. But as he looked closer, he saw that the painted blue eyes were still impossibly vibrant, staring up through the murky water with a placid, unblinking gaze. It swayed gently, back and forth, in a current that did not seem to exist. His medical mind tried to offer an explanation, some pocket of trapped gas, a subtle movement of the water table, but the motion was too regular, too deliberate. It looked as though an invisible child had just dismounted. A few feet away, he saw more. A set of wooden blocks lay on the bottom, not scattered randomly as one would expect, but arranged in a neat, impossible tower, defying the gentle but persistent pressure of the water. And then, in what would have been the corner of a child's room, he saw the doll. It was lying on its back, its calico dress fanned out around it. Its yarn hair, a vibrant red, undulated in the water like living tendrils. Its face, porcelain and pale, was turned upward. Its painted smile was serene, its glass eyes wide and staring directly at him. There was no decay. There was no significant algae growth. These items, which should have been scoured, broken, or rotted away to nothing after months of submersion, were preserved. They were not relics of a tragedy. They were an active, curated display. It was a child's room, meticulously maintained beneath the black, suffocating water of the bayou. The doctor felt a wave of vertigo, his sense of reality tilting violently. He was not an observer of a past event. He was standing in the middle of a present, ongoing impossibility. The cold of the water seemed to travel up his legs and into his very bones, a profound, internal chill that had nothing to do with temperature. This was not a place of the dead. It was a place of the kept. Shaken to his core, the doctor retreated from the water, his boots making loud, sucking sounds as he pulled them from the mud. He needed the testimony of another human being, a confirmation that he was not descending into madness. He found the fisherman back at his shanty, his face etched with a strange mixture of fear and vindication when he saw the doctor approaching. Before Carver could even speak, the fisherman told him that he had something else to report. He said that the previous night, drawn by a morbid curiosity he could not explain, he had pulled his skiff back toward the Duval property. A heavy mist had been rising from the water, he recounted, a thick white fog that muffled all sound. He said that he had not seen the strange pulsing light this time. He had seen something far more terrifying. Through a break in the mist, he claimed to have seen a figure standing on the bank. It was a woman, he said, tall and impossibly thin, wearing something long and white that seemed to billow around her even though there was no breeze. He could not see her face clearly, he reported, as it was shrouded in shadow, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that it was Catherine Duval, and she was not alone. On either side of her, holding her hands, were two smaller figures, indistinct and hazy in the fog. He said they did not move like living people. They glided through the dense, tangled reeds at the water's edge, their passage making no sound, leaving no wake in the water. The fisherman told the doctor that he had watched them for a long moment, a silent, spectral family taking a walk in the dead of night, before he was overcome with a terror so profound that he had dug his pole into the mud and pushed himself away, not stopping until his own small lantern was once again in sight. The fisherman's story, which the doctor would have dismissed as a hallucination just days before, now served as a horrifying corroboration of what he was beginning to understand. The presence at the Duval site was not a passive echo of a tragedy. It was an active, intelligent, and mobile force. That evening, as dusk began to bleed across the sky, turning the clouds a bruised purple and orange, the doctor found himself drawn back to the water's edge. He was no longer acting as a physician or a state official. He was a man compelled by a force he could not name, pulled by an invisible thread of dread and fascination. He stood at the same spot where he had heard the laughter, staring out at the black, placid surface of the water where the Duval house had been. The moon, nearly full, had risen, casting a stark, silver path across the water. The reflection was perfect, a trembling, liquid mirror of the night sky. He stood for a long time, watching, listening. The world was utterly still, and then it began. A single ripple, originating from the center of the submerged foundation, disturbed the moon's reflection. It was a perfect circle, expanding outward until it disappeared. Then another, and another. They were not random. They appeared with a deliberate, rhythmic slowness. He watched, mesmerized, his breath caught in his throat. The ripples began to change, to elongate, to intersect in unnatural ways. They were no longer circles. They were forming patterns, lines, curves. The doctor's mind, trained to recognize patterns, to diagnose from symptoms, watched in stunned, intellectual horror as the lines resolved into shapes he recognized. They were letters. The water itself was writing a message. The first word to form, trembling on the surface, was Eloise. The letters held their shape for a long moment before dissolving. Then came the second name, Gabriel. He was witnessing a direct communication from the entity that resided in this place. The water was its paper, the ripples its ink. His scientific mind was a distant, screaming voice in the back of his skull. As he stared, paralyzed, a new set of ripples began. The letters were sharper this time, more defined, as if written with a greater sense of purpose. A single, 7-letter word that shattered the last of his composure and turned his investigation into a personal nightmare. Carver. The Bayou knew his name. It had identified him. He was no longer the investigator. He was the subject. He stumbled backward, away from the water's edge, his foot catching on something hard and metallic in the soft mud. He nearly fell, catching his balance at the last second. He looked down, his eyes slowly adjusting to the object at his feet. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished and caked with mud, but undeniably of fine craftsmanship. Its chain was broken. With trembling fingers, he picked it up. It felt cold, unnaturally so. He wiped the mud from its surface. There was an intricate engraving of a bird on the front. He knew, with a sickening sense of certainty, that it had belonged to Eloise. The clasp was stiff, but he managed to pry it open. Inside were 2 small, oval frames for miniature portraits, both empty. But that was not what made his breath catch, what made a low, involuntary sound escape his throat. The inside of the locket was not wet, it was perfectly dry, and on the polished silver surface of the interior, preserved in the faint film of condensation that had formed from the warmth of his hand, were 2 small, delicate fingerprints. They were fresh. They were the unmistakable prints of a child, clear and perfectly defined, as if someone had just closed the locket moments before and dropped it at his feet. It was a physical impossibility. It was a piece of tangible, irrefutable evidence that he was dealing with a force that did not obey the laws of his world. He was holding a message, a relic from a place that was not beneath the water, but somewhere else entirely. A place from which small hands could still reach out and touch the world of the living. The revelation was complete. He was not investigating a haunting. He was being initiated into one. The discovery of the locket marked the final, irrevocable dissolution of Dr. Emile Carver's world. The delicate, impossible fingerprints on its inner surface were a definitive and terrifying refutation of every scientific principle he held sacred. The laws of physics, of biology, of the steady, predictable march of time and decay had been suspended in this small, silver object. He had retreated from the Bayou that night in a state of clinical shock, his physician's mind cataloging his own symptoms: a tremor in his hands, an accelerated heart rate, a profound sense of derealization, as if he were observing his own actions from a great and echoing distance. The locket, now wrapped in a clean linen handkerchief and tucked into his breast pocket, felt like a cold, heavy weight against his chest, a constant, physical reminder of the impossible truth he now carried. He no longer saw himself as an agent of the state, a compiler of facts. He was a witness to an event that had no place in any official record, a story that could not be told in the neat, angular script of his ledger. The haunting of Lafourche Parish was not an echo of a past tragedy. It was not the lingering psychic residue of a grieving mother. It was something more fundamental, something that had been present long before the Duvals had built their home on its sorrowful ground. Driven by a new, desperate need for a context that transcended his own limited experience, he sought out the elders of the parish, the few remaining men and women whose memories were not bound by the flood of 1874, but reached back into the deeper, murkier waters of the parish's history. He found them in their small, surviving homes, rooms that smelled of wood smoke, chamomile, and old age. He no longer approached them as a doctor seeking data, but as a supplicant seeking wisdom. He did not speak of ripples forming his name or of fresh fingerprints in a submerged locket. He knew such talk would brand him a madman. Instead, he asked them about the land itself, about the stories their grandparents had told them, about the old myths that the church had tried so hard to supplant. He asked about the bend in the bayou, the place where the water ran black and still. At first, they were reticent, their eyes clouded with a familiar, guarded fear. But as he sat with them, not as an official, but as a man clearly troubled, they began to speak. They spoke in low, hushed tones, their voices raspy with age, their words weaving a tapestry of folklore that was far older and darker than the story of Catherine Duval. They did not call the entity Catherine. They called her La Mère du Bayou, the Bayou Mother. They described a presence that had always been a part of the parish, an entity as old as the cypress trees themselves. The stories varied in their details, passed down and reshaped through generations, but their core elements remained terrifyingly consistent. She was a spirit of profound and possessive maternal grief, a being drawn to places of loss. They said that she was not the ghost of a single woman, but an eternal archetype, a sorrow that would periodically awaken and seek to embody itself in the flesh of a grieving mother. One old man, his hands gnarled and twisted by arthritis into the shape of cypress roots, told the doctor a story from his own grandfather's time, long before the Civil War. He spoke of a young Creole woman whose infant child had been taken by a fever. In her inconsolable grief, she had taken to wandering the edges of the bayou, calling her child's name. The townsfolk had pitied her, then feared her, as her sorrow seemed to curdle into something unnatural. He said she was found one morning, standing waist-deep in the black water at the same bend in the bayou, her arms cradling a bundle of moss and driftwood as if it were her lost child. She was smiling, her eyes vacant. She was never seen again, but for a generation afterward, travelers on the bayou would report hearing a woman's lullaby drifting from the reeds and the faint, phantom cry of a baby. Another elder, the same frail matriarch who had spoken to him of the fever of the earth, shared a different, even older tale. One, she said, came from the time of the first French trappers. It was a story of a native woman of the Chitimacha tribe, whose children had been killed in a conflict with the new settlers. The woman, consumed by a rage and grief that her people found terrifying, had performed a forbidden ritual on that patch of land. She had offered her own sorrow to the ancient, hungry spirits of the swamp, begging them to give her back her children. The story said the bayou had answered her. It had taken her, and in her place, it had created a permanent wound in the world, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thin, a place where profound maternal love could be twisted into a predatory, enduring hunger. The Bayou Mother was not a ghost. She was a genius loci, the spirit of the place, an entity that fed on grief and wore the faces of the bereaved. Catherine Duval was not the cause of the haunting. She was merely its most recent victim, her own devastating loss having made her a perfect vessel for the ancient sorrow that dwelled there. The flood of 1874 had not created the entity. It had simply provided it with a fresh and powerful source of the very thing it craved, the inconsolable grief of a mother for her lost children. Carver returned to his office in the church, the kerosene lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The folklore he had gathered did not bring him comfort. It did not provide a rational explanation, but it did provide a horrifyingly coherent framework. He was not dealing with a ghost, but with a recurring, predatory myth that had become manifest. He sat down at his table and opened his journal, not the official ledger for the state, but his private log, the one where he had allowed himself to record the mounting inconsistencies of the case. He began to write, his hand moving with a frantic, feverish energy. He described the stories of the elders, the history of La Mer du Bayou. He wrote about the preserved toys, the fisherman's spectral sighting, the impossible locket. He was no longer trying to solve a mystery. He was creating an archive, a testament for whoever might come after him. As he wrote, a strange phenomenon began to occur, one so subtle at first that he did not notice it. The ink from his pen seemed to darken on the page, to take on a wet, glossy sheen, as if it were refusing to dry in the humid air. He paused, touching a finger to a freshly written word. The ink was not just wet, it was cold, and it carried the faint, unmistakable scent of river mud. A creeping, intellectual dread, colder and more profound than any fear he had yet experienced, began to wash over him. He started to flip back through the pages of his journal, examining his own entries from the previous days and weeks. He looked at his notes from his first interview with the priest, written on the day of his arrival. The date, clearly marked at the top of the page, was correct. But as he read the entry, he saw a sentence he had no memory of writing. It was a short, declarative statement, written in his own hand, yet utterly alien to him. The sentence read, "The Bayou knows my name." His blood ran cold. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had not written those words on that day. The phenomenon had not occurred until he had seen his name rippling on the water's surface, an event that had taken place weeks later. His journal, his own meticulous record of the linear progression of time and evidence, was exhibiting a temporal distortion. The book was not merely a record of events. It was becoming an artifact of the haunting itself, its pages rearranging the past to conform to the horrifying present. He frantically turned to other pages, his hands shaking so badly that he risked tearing the thin paper. He found another anomaly in his notes on the fisherman's testimony. Tucked at the end of a paragraph describing the pulsing green light was another sentence in his own script. "She is keeping the children safe beneath the water." He had not thought that. He had not even considered such a possibility at that stage. He had been searching for rational explanations, for swamp gas and tricks of the light. The journal was not recording his investigation, it was narrating his descent. The entity was not just in the bayou, it was here, in this room, its influence seeping into the very ink he used, turning his chronicle of facts into a prophecy of his own coming revelation. The past was not fixed. It was as fluid and mutable as the black water of the bayou, and it was being rewritten to lead him to a single, inevitable conclusion. A sudden, powerful storm broke over the parish, a common occurrence in the late summer, but its violence felt personal, directed. Rain hammered against the slate roof of the church, and the wind howled around the stone walls like a grieving woman. A flash of lightning illuminated the room in a stark, blue-white glare, followed an instant later by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. In that brief, brilliant moment of illumination, he looked out the single, high window of his office, a window that faced toward the bayou, and he saw it. Through the torrential downpour, clear as day, stood the Duval house. It was not a ruin. It was not a submerged foundation. It was whole, intact, and perfectly dry. The clapboard was white and pristine, the porch was level, and a warm, yellow light shone from the downstairs windows, a welcoming beacon in the storm. It stood on the shoreline, solid and real, in a place where he knew for a fact there was only mud and black water. The vision lasted only for the duration of the lightning flash. When the darkness rushed back in, it was gone. He was left staring out into the rain-swept blackness, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew what he had seen. It was not a memory, not an illusion. It was an invitation. The flood that had destroyed the house, the flood that had defined the tragedy of this parish, had, for a brief, impossible moment, receded from a single, cursed patch of ground. The house had resurfaced, pulled from the depths of the Bayou's memory, a phantom structure made real. The distinction between myth and reality, between the past and the present, had finally collapsed entirely. The Bayou mother was no longer just showing him signs and leaving cryptic clues. She was calling him home. She was inviting him into the place where her children were kept safe, the place where the flood never ended, and yet had never truly begun. He understood now that he was not just investigating the curse, he was a character in its latest chapter, and the story required him to play his part. The storm that had momentarily revealed the phantom Duval house passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and unnervingly silent. The air, scrubbed of its oppressive humidity, was now cool and carried the clean, earthy scent of rain-soaked soil and ozone. But for Dr. Emil Carver, this tranquility was a profound and terrifying deception. The vision of the house, solid and dry in the midst of the deluge, had not been a fleeting hallucination. It was a summons, a deliberate and undeniable gesture from the entity that had consumed his every waking thought. He understood now that his role as a passive observer was over. The meticulous collection of evidence, the interviews, the careful annotation in his journal, all of it had been a prelude, a slow and methodical initiation that had led him to this single, inevitable moment of confrontation. The Bayou mother had shown him her home, a place that existed outside the normal flow of time, a sanctuary of grief, held intact against the ravages of the material world. And now, he had to enter it. There was no longer a question of if, but only of how. He was not driven by courage, nor by a heroic desire to end a curse. He was moved by a horrifying, intellectual compulsion, the need of a scientist to see the experiment through to its conclusion, even if he himself was the final variable to be tested. He did not wait for daylight. He knew that the entity's power was strongest in the liminal spaces, in the twilight and the pre-dawn gray, and he felt a chilling certainty that the house would only be accessible to him now, in the immediate, electrically charged aftermath of the storm. He took nothing with him but his kerosene lamp and the small, leather-bound journal that had become his accursed collaborator. The locket remained in his pocket, a cold, silver talisman against a reality he no longer trusted. The walk to the bayou was a dreamlike passage. The moon had emerged from behind the retreating clouds, full and luminous, casting the sodden landscape in a stark, monochromatic relief. The Spanish moss, heavy with rainwater, dripped with a sound like 1,000 tiny, weeping things. Every shadow seemed to writhe with a life of its own, and the gnarled cypress knees breaking the surface of the black water looked like hunched, waiting figures. He was no longer afraid of these things. His fear had been refined into something colder, sharper, a state of pure, intellectual dread. He was a man walking knowingly into a page of impossible folklore, a physician preparing to dissect a myth. As he rounded the final bend, he saw that the vision had not been an illusion. The house stood before him, exactly as he had seen it in the lightning flash. It was a modest, 2-story structure of white clapboard, with a narrow porch and dark green shutters. It was not pristine, as it had appeared from a distance. Up close, he could see a fine layer of river silt coating every surface, a pale, gray dust that clung to the wood like a funeral shroud. The air around it was unnaturally still and cold, and the house itself seemed to absorb the moonlight, giving off no reflection. It was a place that was both physically present and fundamentally unreal, a solid shadow cast upon the land. The front door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, not with the screech of rust, but with a low, mournful sound, like a sigh of resignation. He stepped inside, raising his lamp. The interior was not what he expected. It was not filled with the chaotic, water-damaged debris of a flood. The small parlor was neat and orderly, the furniture in its proper place, though everything was coated in the same fine, gray silt. A rocking chair sat by the cold hearth. A small table held a sewing basket, a needle still resting in a piece of unfinished embroidery. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, frozen in time, a perfect, three-dimensional photograph of a life that had been interrupted. But the air was wrong. It was cold, stagnant, and carried a faint, cloying, sweet smell, like that of wilting flowers and damp earth. It was the air of a tomb, meticulously arranged to resemble a home. He moved through the downstairs rooms, his footsteps silent on the silt-covered floorboards. The kitchen was the same. A loaf of bread, now hard as stone, sat on a cutting board, a knife beside it. A set of child's tin cups were arranged in a neat row on a shelf. The silence was absolute. There was no drip of water, no creak of settling wood. It was the profound, vacuum-sealed silence of a place that existed outside of time. He knew what he was looking for. He was searching for the source of the cold, the heart of the house's unnatural preservation. On the far side of the kitchen, he found a small, unassuming door, one that would have likely led to a pantry or a small larder. When he opened it, a wave of cold, damp air washed over him, far colder than the rest of the house. It carried the raw, primal scent of the deep earth, of wet clay and tangled roots. The lamplight revealed a narrow, steep set of wooden stairs leading down into darkness. It was a root cellar, a place for preserving things against the passage of seasons. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like the last truly free action he would ever take, he began his descent. The cellar was small and square, the walls made of packed earth and held in place by a lattice of thick, dark cypress roots that seemed to have grown into the space intentionally. The air was thick, heavy, and difficult to breathe, saturated with the smell of wet soil and something else, something vaguely organic and unnervingly sweet. His lamp cast a small, trembling pool of light, pushing back a darkness that felt ancient and alive. The floor was not earth, but a thin layer of black, stagnant water that perfectly mirrored the wooden ceiling above, creating the disorienting illusion that he was standing suspended in an infinite dark space. And then he saw them. In the center of the room, there were three shapes, three cocoons of woven vines and river reeds, bound so tightly they resembled crude, human effigies. One was larger, the size of a grown woman. The other two were small, the size of children. They were arranged in a tableau, the two smaller shapes nestled against the larger one, a grotesque parody of a mother embracing her children. A low, continuous sound emanated from them, a soft, whispering hum that was not quite human and not quite the sound of insects. As he drew closer, his lamp held high. The whispering resolved into distinct, recognizable sounds. It was the sound of voices, the high, melodic voices of a young boy and a young girl. They were not speaking words, but humming a simple, repetitive lullaby, the same tune endlessly circling back on itself. It was a sound of profound innocence, made obscene by its source. The air around the bound shapes was not cold. It was warm. A faint biological heat radiated from them, a sign of some slow metabolic process. This was not a grave. It was a nursery. He stood paralyzed, his scientific mind trying and failing to categorize what he was seeing. This was not a haunting. This was a form of biology, a terrifying, symbiotic relationship between the land, the water, and the captured essence of human grief. The entity was not a ghost. It was a gardener, and this was its harvest. He had a sudden, horrifying understanding that what was bound within these vines was not the dead, but the perpetually dying, their life force being used to sustain something else, to fuel the illusion of the house above, to power the ripples in the water. Eloise and Gabriel were not gone. They were here, preserved, their last moments of life and love for their mother, endlessly replayed, a spiritual sustenance for the ancient, hungry thing that had claimed them. As he stared, a new voice joined the children's humming. It was not coming from the bound shapes, but from the air around him, from the very walls of the cellar. It was a woman's voice, soft, gentle, and filled with a sorrow so profound it was almost beautiful. It was the voice of Catherine Duval. The voice spoke his name, Emile. It was not a question, not a threat. It was a statement of recognition, of welcome. She told him that he had been so clever, that he had followed the clues and found her secret place. She said that he had seen the pain of the town, the sorrow of the flood. She told him that he, too, had a grief inside him, the cool, detached sorrow of the lonely, the intellectual grief of a man who sees the world as a machine and is terrified to find that it has a soul. Her voice was a scalpel, expertly dissecting his own carefully guarded psyche. Then, the voice made its offer. It was not an offer of harm, but of inclusion. She told him that motherhood was a terrible, beautiful burden, a love so fierce it would burn down the world to keep its children safe. She asked him if he wanted to understand. She offered to let him see what that love truly cost. She offered to let him join their perfect, unending family, a long, pale tendril of vine, slick with black water, detached itself from the largest shape and began to snake slowly across the surface of the water toward his feet. The humming of the children grew louder, more insistent, their simple lullaby twisting into a hypnotic, beckoning chant. The doctor did not scream. The part of him capable of such a simple, human reaction was long gone. He was an intellect trapped in a cage of supernatural horror, and his final, coherent thought was one of profound, catastrophic revelation. What was buried beneath this house was not human. It was an ancient, vegetative intelligence, a consciousness born of the swamp itself. It had no concept of love or grief, as humans understood them. It had only hunger and mimicry. It had found in Catherine Duval a perfect template, a grief so pure and powerful that it had been able to replicate it, to wear her sorrow like a mask. It had taken her children not out of malice, but out of a biological imperative, preserving them, sustaining them, using their essence to power its illusion and lure in new sources of emotional energy. What if love, he thought, a love taken to its most extreme, possessive, and terrified conclusion, becomes the most perfect and enduring form of haunting? The vine touched his boot. The water in the cellar began to rise, not as a flood from without, but as a spring from within, bubbling up from the earthen floor. The children's voices were inside his head now, whispering his name, telling him that their mother had been waiting, that she had made a place for him. He saw the house above in his mind's eye, a fourth chair appearing at the silt-covered kitchen table. The lamplight flickered, casting his long shadow on the earthen wall. And as the black, cold water rose to his waist, Dr. Emile Carver finally understood. He was not here to close the case. He was here to become a part of the permanent, official record. The water covered his lamp, and the cellar was plunged into absolute perfect darkness. The last thing he heard being the gentle, welcoming voice of the mother, telling him it was all right, that he was home now, that he would never have to be alone again. The year is 1882. 8 years have passed since the Great Storm, a span of time that has allowed Lafourche Parish to begin the slow, arduous process of healing, both of its land and of its memory. The Bayou, for the most part, has returned to its old, familiar boundaries. New homes have been built, their fresh-cut pine a stark, pale contrast to the gray, water-stained wood of the surviving structures. A new generation of children has been born, children whose only knowledge of the flood comes from the hushed, cautionary tales of their parents. The story of Catherine Duval and her lost children has begun its inevitable transformation from a raw, open wound of a memory into the scar tissue of local folklore, a ghostly tale told on dark, stormy nights to frighten the young and remind the old of the Bayou's capricious power. The name of the visiting doctor from New Orleans, the one who came to catalog the dead and then vanished as mysteriously as the Duvals themselves, is rarely spoken. His disappearance was officially recorded as an unfortunate accident, another victim of the treacherous, waterlogged landscape. He was a man with no local family, an outsider whose brief, intense presence had been a strange fever dream in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. He, like the Duvals, had been claimed by the Bayou, his heavy leather ledger the only part of him ever to be found. Discovered months later, half buried in the mud near the old church, its pages sealed shut by a thick, waxy combination of mildew and river silt. A new physician has taken up residence in the parish, a practical, no-nonsense man named Alistair Finch. He is a man who deals in broken bones, fevers, and the predictable, biological certainties of birth and death. He has heard the whispers of the past, the ghost stories and superstitions, but he dismisses them as the predictable psychological residue of a traumatized community. His world is one of science, of progress, of the steady, inexorable march of modernity that he believes will eventually banish such shadows. He has been given the old office in the stone church, the same room from which his predecessor had vanished. The room has been aired out and whitewashed, but on damp nights, a faint, persistent smell of river decay and something metallic, like old ink, still seems to rise from the floorboards. It is here that he keeps his medical supplies and his own set of neat, orderly records. One rainy afternoon, while clearing out a forgotten cabinet in the corner of the room, he discovers the sealed ledger of his predecessor. Dr. Finch, a man with a professional curiosity, spends the better part of an hour carefully prying the warped cover open, the sealed pages making a sound like tearing fabric as they separate. The ink inside, to his astonishment, is not faded or washed away. It is a deep, dark black, and in many places, it has a strange, wet sheen, as if it had been written only yesterday. He begins to read, at first with a detached, clinical interest. He sees the meticulous records of the flood's victims, the work of a man who was clearly a thorough and dedicated professional. But as he progresses deeper into the volume, the entries begin to change. The neat, angular script becomes more hurried, more frantic. The dispassionate observations give way to obsessive, sprawling notes about a single case, the Duvals. He reads about the contradictory testimonies, the strange, pulsing light, the duplicated names in the parish registry. He reads page after page of dense philosophical ramblings about the nature of grief and the porosity of certain landscapes. The final entries are a descent into what Finch can only diagnose as a complete psychotic breakdown. The writer describes seeing houses that are not there, of hearing voices, of a temporal distortion within the pages of the journal itself. It is a harrowing, first-hand account of a brilliant mind collapsing under the weight of isolation and trauma. Dr. Finch, a man of rational thought, feels a profound sense of pity for this unknown Dr. Carver. He sees the journal not as a record of the supernatural, but as a tragic case study in madness, a cautionary tale of what can happen when an educated man allows himself to be consumed by the primitive fears of a backwater community. He is about to close the book, to put this sad story away and perhaps burn it later to prevent its madness from infecting others, when he notices a final, chilling entry. It is on the very last page, written in a script that is almost illegibly frantic, the letters gouged into the paper with a desperate, heavy pressure. The ink is darker than all the rest, and it is smudged with a fine, gray powder that he recognizes, with a jolt, as dried silt. The entry is short, just 2 sentences, a final, lucid thought from a mind on the brink of oblivion. The first sentence reads, "She forgave me." Dr. Finch frowns, the words making no sense in any context he can imagine. Forgave him for what? For his intrusion? For his disbelief? It is the second sentence, however, that makes the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. The words seem to pulse on the page, to carry a weight that defies their simple structure. The final entry in Dr. Emil Carver's journal reads, "But she will never stop looking for her children." A sudden gust of wind rattles the shutters of the church, and the rain begins to fall harder, tapping against the window pane with the sound of insistent, tiny fingers. Dr. Finch closes the ledger, a sudden, inexplicable chill seeping into the room, a cold that has nothing to do with the autumn weather. In the weeks that follow, a strange and quiet phenomenon begins to occur in Lafourche Parish. The children, the new generation born after the flood, begin to speak of a new game. They play it near the edges of the cypress groves, in the misty hours of the late afternoon. They call it the Singing Mother. When their parents ask about the rules, the children cannot explain them. They simply say that if you stand very still and listen, you can sometimes hear a woman singing a lullaby, her voice carried on the wind from the direction of the deep bayou. They say it is a sad song, but a beautiful one. They say that if you are very quiet and very lucky, you might see her. They describe a tall, pale woman in a long white dress, who walks among the trees, her face always turned away. They are not afraid of her. They say she seems lonely, that she is just looking for someone to play with. The parents, with a shiver of an old, half-remembered fear, forbid their children from playing the game, telling them the bayou is dangerous, that the ground is still soft and treacherous. They tell their children that there is no woman, that it is just the sound of the wind in the Spanish moss. Dr. Finch, too, hears the stories from his young patients. He dismisses them as the overactive imaginations of children, fueled by the old, lingering folklore of the region. He is a man of science, and he does not believe in singing ghosts. Yet, he finds himself unable to completely shake the unease that his predecessor's journal has instilled in him. He sometimes finds his thoughts drifting to that final, cryptic entry. He will be sitting in his office late at night, the rain tapping on the shutters, and he will imagine he hears a faint, distant melody woven into the sound. He tells himself it is an auditory illusion, a trick of the mind, but the thought persists, an unwelcome guest in the orderly house of his reason. The memory of the ghastly Bayou mother, the one who haunted her children, has receded, but the entity itself has not. It has simply changed its face, its methods. It no longer needs the raw, powerful grief of a Catherine Duval to anchor it. It has the captured, looping essence of Dr. Carver as well, a different kind of sorrow, the intellectual loneliness that it can now use as a lure. The haunting has become more subtle, more patient, a quiet song on the wind instead of a terrifying apparition. It is still looking for its children. Not just Eloise and Gabriel, who are forever safe in its cold embrace, but new children, any children, drawn in by the promise of a beautiful, sad song. The cycle has not been broken, it has been reinforced. The parish rebuilt its homes, but the foundation of the old, sorrowful ground remains. Grief. Dr. Finch is slowly, unwillingly beginning to understand, does not die. It does not fade. It simply inherits new names, new faces, new generations to feed upon. The final, irrefutable proof of this comes not from a ghost story, but from the official parish record, the very book that Dr. Carver had once consulted. The new priest, a young, optimistic man from New Orleans, is updating the registry. He comes across a strange anomaly that he cannot explain. In the section for births for the year 1882, he finds 3 names that have been added at the bottom of the page, written in an old-fashioned, spidery script that is not his own. There were no recorded births in the parish that autumn. No baptisms were performed for these children. They are simply there, 3 new names added to the long, official history of Lafourche Parish. The names are not Eloise, Gabriel, or even Emile. They are new names, the names of 3 local children who had been reported missing over the last several months, children who had last been seen playing near the edge of the bayou, listening for the sound of a singing woman. The case file on Lafourche Parish is never truly closed. It is merely passed on, a legacy of sorrow, a history that becomes a haunting that writes itself into the next chapter of history. The case file on the flooded house on Bayou Lafourche is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.